Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It started the way many unforgettable nights do, quietly. The rain had begun sometime after dinner, tapping gently at the kitchen windows like a distant drumbeat. I remember standing by the sink, my hands deep in warm, soapy water, when the sky suddenly cracked open with a flash of lightning. The rumble that followed was deep and long, rolling through the valley like the echo of something ancient and unresolved. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on a dish towel, glancing over at the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It was just past 8. My husband, Mark, was out of town on a business trip, his third this month, and the house felt emptier than usual. Not lonely exactly, just still. I was halfway to the living room when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tapping on the front door. I froze, instinctively tightening the belt of my robe. Who comes over during a thunderstorm without calling first? I peeked through the side window and immediately felt my breath catch. It was David, Mark's best friend since childhood. David, with his ever-serious eyes and that familiar wool coat, was standing on the porch, rain streaming off his shoulders. His hair was soaked, clinging to his forehead, and his hand was still raised, like he wasn't sure he'd knocked hard enough. I opened the door, and the wind rushed in behind him, carrying the scent of wet pine and earth. "David?" I asked, stepping aside so he could come in. "What on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "I was driving home from the cabin," he said, wiping his shoes on the mat. "Took the back roads and didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Thought I'd stop by. Figured you shouldn't be alone with a storm like this rolling through." I smiled, a little surprised, but not displeased. "That's thoughtful of you. Come in before you catch pneumonia." He stepped inside, and I closed the door behind him, locking out the wind and the world. The hallway lights cast a soft amber glow around us, and for a moment, everything felt oddly suspended in time. "Let me get you a towel," I said, already heading to the linen closet. By the time I returned, he'd removed his coat and shoes, and stood there in jeans and a navy sweater, his arms crossed as he looked around like he hadn't been here in years, even though he'd visited just last month. I handed him the towel. "You're soaked." Storm caught me by surprise. I was halfway down Miller's Pass before I realized I'd made a mistake. I laughed softly. Miller's Pass is always a mistake. He smiled, that rare, crooked smile of his that never quite reached his eyes. "Yeah, well, I make a lot of those lately." Didn't know what to say to that. Something in his tone gave me pause. He wasn't just here because of the rain. We sat in the living room a while later, the fire crackling in the hearth. I made tea for both of us, and we talked about little things. How the roof was holding up, Mark's upcoming promotion, the new neighbors down the road who were keeping chickens now. Ordinary things. But David wasn't really there for small talk. I could feel it in the way he kept glancing toward the window, watching the storm like it might say something he couldn't. Eventually, I asked, "What's really going on, David?" He looked at me, really looked at me. And for the first time in all the years I'd known him, I saw something behind those eyes that startled me, a deep, quiet sorrow. "I shouldn't be here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't drive any farther. Not tonight." "You're always welcome here," I said, a little softer. "You know that." "I know, and that's the problem." His words settled into the room like dust. I leaned forward, setting my tea down on the coffee table, suddenly unsure of the space between us. We'd shared holidays, camping trips, countless dinners, and wine-fueled card games. David had been part of my life for over 20 years. He was Mark's best friend, and mine too, in his own quiet way. "Talk to me," I said gently. "What's eating at you?" He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled something out. A folded letter. He handed it to me without a word. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't even meant for me. It was from Mark, to David, written in ink that had bulged just slightly at the edges from the damp. And the words, oh, the words. "I've loved her for years," it said. "You know I have. But she's not mine to love the way I want to. And she never will be." I read it twice, maybe 3 times. My mind couldn't quite process it at first. When I finally looked up, David was staring into the fire, his jaw tight. "I found it yesterday," he said. "In one of the books Mark
I didn't know
lent
what
me.
to say.
The letter didn't name me. I think he meant for
But
me
it
to
didn't
find
have
it
to.
eventually."
Why are you showing me this?
I asked, my voice barely steady. "Because I needed you to know. Because I needed to stop carrying this weight alone." The room was so quiet, I could hear the firewood pop and sizzle. Outside, the rain battered the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers trying to get in. And something inside me cracked. Not in a painful way, not even in a way I understood, but in a way that felt like something long buried had just been gently unearthed. I looked at David again, really looked, and for the first time, I saw him not as Mark's best friend, not as the man who helped us move furniture or fixed our leaking sink, but as someone who had been quietly orbiting my life with a kind of reverent distance. And I wondered, had I been orbiting him too? The letter lay on the coffee table between us like something sacred and dangerous all at once. I don't know how long we sat in silence after that. Maybe it was only a few minutes, maybe longer. The storm outside had settled into a rhythm, soft and steady now, a lullaby for memories we hadn't spoken aloud. I was still holding the edge of the letter, my fingers brushing the delicate paper, afraid to let go of it, afraid of what might follow if I did. "He never said anything," I murmured. "Not once." David nodded. "He wouldn't. That's the kind of man he is." "And you?" I looked at him, my voice barely a breath. "Have you known all this time?" He turned to me slowly, his eyes dark and solemn. "I suspected. You see things when you're on the outside looking in. The way he watched you. The way he lit up when you walked into a room. He never said it aloud, but I knew." A painful lump rose in my throat. "Why now? Why tell me now?" "Because I couldn't keep pretending." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought I could be the loyal friend, the quiet witness. But finding that letter, it changed everything. It made me realize just how long I've been living with something I haven't been able to say either." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly like he was holding back a tide of emotion. "I never planned to feel anything for you. You were Mark's wife, his partner. But over the years, things happened. Small moments. You'd laugh at something I said, or touch my arm when you were grateful, or just look at me like I mattered, and I felt things I shouldn't have. I buried them because I thought it was the right thing to do." I swallowed hard. "David, I never wanted to hurt you, or him. God knows, I've tried to keep my distance. But being around you all these years, watching the way you hold a room, the way you care for everyone but rarely yourself, it's been a slow ache." His voice trembled at the edges now. "And tonight, when I found that letter, I realized Mark was hurting too. We both were, quietly.
respectfully, but it doesn't change the truth. The truth. That word echoed in my mind like a bell. I stood up, unable to sit still anymore, and walked over to the window. The rain had softened, now a misty shimmer against the glass. The trees in the backyard swayed gently, their leaves glistening in the porch light. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted. "It feels like everything's shifted." David came to stand beside me, but not too close. Just enough that I could feel the heat of him. Just enough to sense the pull. "You don't have to do anything," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't want to live another day without being honest." I turned to face him. "You're not the only one who's been holding things in." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "There were times I looked for you in a room before I looked for Mark," I confessed, shame-brushing my words. "Times when I found myself thinking about our conversations long after they were over. You've always been kind to me in a way that felt different, safer, and I ignored that feeling because I thought it was wrong." "It wasn't wrong," he said, barely above a whisper. "It was human." I closed my eyes. My heart was beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't what I'd expected tonight, not in the slightest, but the honesty in the room was undeniable. Heavy, yes. Complicated, of course, but real. When I opened my eyes again, David hadn't moved. He was waiting, calm, respectful, heart-bare. "Have you ever told Mark?" I asked. "No, never, and I never would. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would fade. But it didn't." "No," he said. "It only grew quieter." The room felt warmer now, though the fire had settled into glowing embers. I reached for the folded letter again, smoothing it out on the table. My fingers traced Mark's handwriting, the familiar curves and slants.
"You know
was
what
no
the worst
anger in
part
words.
is?"
No
I said,
bitterness,
sitting down
just
again.
acceptance.
David
A
looked at
quiet
me.
sadness.
"I don't know if I'm angry or relieved." He didn't answer, just sat down across from me and nodded like he understood, and I think he did. We sat like that for a long while, two people bound by history, tethered by truths we never meant to share, and drawn together by something we could no longer ignore. Eventually, the storm passed. The air outside was crisp and clean, and the sky had softened into a deep indigo. We stood in the doorway as David prepared to leave, the tension between us more tender now, shaped by understanding instead of fear. "Thank you for being honest," I said as he put on his coat. "Thank you for listening." I stepped out onto the porch with him, the wood damp beneath my bare feet. As he walked down the path to his car, he turned back once. Just once. Our eyes met across the rain-slicked night, and there was something in his expression, an apology, a question, maybe even hope. And then he was gone. But something stayed behind. Something neither of us had words for yet. The next morning came with sunlight, bright, almost painfully so. I stood at the kitchen sink, cradling a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, the world looked freshly washed. The trees sparkled, the ground glistened, and there was a hush in the air that only follows a night like the one before. But inside me, everything was loud. Mark was due home that evening. I hadn't slept much, not because of guilt, but because of the 1,000 thoughts spinning through my mind. David's words, that letter, the look in his eyes when he said he'd love me in silence, the realization that I had, in some way, loved him too, differently, quietly, but no less real. I carried it all with me as I moved through the day like a woman in a dream. I vacuumed the living room, changed the bedsheets,
Made a list for the grocery store, but never went. My heart kept replaying David's voice, especially that one line. It wasn't wrong. It was human. How many years had I pushed away that very idea? How many times had I told myself I was imagining the warmth in his gaze, the way our conversations lingered longer than they should have? By the time Mark's car pulled into the driveway at dusk, I felt raw with clarity and confusion. He walked in like he always did, smiling, suitcase in one hand, jacket slung over the other. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Miss me?" I nodded, but my throat was tight. "Of course. How was the trip?" "Long," he groaned, setting down his bag. "Flights were delayed. Had to sit next to a guy who wouldn't stop snoring. I need a shower and a real meal." I tried to smile, but it faltered. He didn't seem to notice. He talked through dinner, catching me up on the project he'd been working on, the client who nearly walked out, the hotel coffee that tasted like burnt socks. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my mind wasn't in the room. Not really. After we cleaned up, he sat on the couch with the TV remote while I lingered near the fireplace. I stared at the shelf where I'd put the letter. Tucked away in an old book like some ghost waiting to be remembered. He noticed. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, then nodded, just thinking. He muted the TV. "About?" I turned to him slowly. "About you, about us, about David." His face changed, not dramatically, just a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "What about him?" I stepped closer. He stopped by last night, during the storm. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" "He found a letter," I said softly. "One you wrote. To him." Now he was still. I saw it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his hand slowly lowered the remote to his lap. He didn't ask which letter. He didn't have to. "I didn't mean for you to see it," he said after a long silence. "But I did," I replied. "And I think I needed to." He nodded slowly, almost painfully. "It was stupid. Just something I wrote late one night when I'd had too much wine and too many regrets. I wasn't ever going to give it to him." "Why not?" "Because it would hurt you, and it wouldn't change anything." I walked to the edge of the couch, but didn't sit. I needed to stand. I needed to feel the strength of my own body beneath the weight of what I was about to say. "Mark, did you ever think about telling me?" He looked up at me, eyes heavy. "Every day. But you were happy, or at least I thought you were. And I didn't want to be the one who broke that." "You didn't break anything," I said quietly. "But hiding it didn't protect us either." He looked down, rubbing his palms against his jeans. I didn't know what to do with how I felt. Loving you the way I did, and seeing you slowly drift away. I wasn't angry, just helpless. I sat then, slowly, across from him. I didn't mean to drift. I think I just started feeling unseen. His eyes flicked up to mine, wet and full. "I saw you, Ellie. I always did. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore. That broke something in me. Not in a sharp, destructive way, but in a soft, releasing way. Like opening a window after years of stale air." I reached for his hand. "I don't blame you. I don't think I ever could. But maybe we both stopped being honest with each other a long time ago." He nodded. "And David? I didn't lie. I don't know what this means, Mark. I really don't. But last night, for the first time in a long while, someone looked at me and saw me, not as your wife, not as a hostess, not as someone holding it all together, but just as me.
He closed his eyes briefly. And how did that feel? I didn't answer at first. Then, finally, I whispered. It felt like breathing. A long silence stretched between us. "I'm not angry," he said after a moment. "Strangely enough, I think I've known for a while that there was something between you two. I didn't want to admit it, because if I did, I'd have to admit what was happening to us." I squeezed his hand. "What do we do now?" He took a deep breath. "We be honest. For once. Brutally honest. Even if it hurts." And so we talked. For hours. About the years we'd spent avoiding the cracks in our marriage. About the quiet disappointments. The distance that crept in, unnoticed. About love. Not the kind that burns hot, but the kind that smolders and waits and sometimes fades without a sound. It was the hardest conversation we'd ever had, but it was also the most human. Not quickly, not slowly, just in the strange, disjointed way time moves when life is rearranging itself. Mark and I didn't separate. We didn't fight. We just existed, gently, like people who had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. There was a kind of peace in honesty, even when it hurt. He began spending more time at the office, and I began walking in the mornings, sometimes for miles, letting the cool air and rustling trees sort through my thoughts. I didn't see David in that time. I think we both knew we needed space, not because of shame, but because the truth needed time to settle. One rainy afternoon, the kind where the clouds roll in like old memories, I found myself driving toward the cabin. Mark had gone there many times with David over the years, and sometimes with me too. It was a place of solitude, surrounded by pine and silence, with a creaky front porch and a fireplace that smoked a little if you didn't open the flue just right. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I think part of me needed to know if he'd be there. And he was. His truck was parked just off the gravel path, speckled with mud. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the faint glow of the cabin windows through the misting rain. My heart felt steady, not racing, not nervous, just present. When I knocked, David opened the door without surprise. He looked older somehow. Tired, maybe. But when he saw me, his face softened in that quiet way only his ever did. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said. I didn't either. He stepped aside, letting me in. The cabin smelled of cedar and rain and something simmering on the stove. He'd always been good with simple meals. I remembered that from summers past, how he made soup with whatever he had and somehow made it taste like comfort itself. We sat near the fire, 2 mugs between us, the silence full but not awkward. "I talked to Mark," I said eventually. He nodded. "I figured you would. He knows everything now." David's eyes met mine. "And he didn't fall apart. Neither did I." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That sounds like progress." I exhaled. "It is." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "I never wanted to come between you two." "I know," I said. "But sometimes the heart has its own map." He looked away, nodding slowly. "I don't know what this is between us." I continued, my words soft but sure. "But it's not nothing. It never was." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I convinced myself for years that just being close to you was enough, that watching you from the edge of your life would be the price of loving you." I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You don't have to love me from the edge anymore, but I need time, space, to figure out who I am now, outside of being Mark's wife, outside of all the roles I've played for everyone but myself. He looked down at our hands. I'll wait for whatever this becomes, or doesn't. Tears stung my eyes, not from sadness, but from the beauty of his words, the gentleness, the patience. We didn't kiss. We didn't touch beyond that one hand between us. But something passed between us all the same. A quiet promise not rooted in urgency or lust, but in deep respect. In love that had learned restraint and grown wiser for it. Later, we stood on the porch as the rain came again, soft and steady. The trees swayed like they were exhaling after holding their breath too long. I don't regret last night, I told him. He looked at me. Neither do I. I'm going home tomorrow, I said, to figure out what that even means now. He nodded. And I'll be here, or somewhere nearby. You don't have to decide anything yet. The wind picked up, brushing a strand of hair across my cheek. He reached up and tucked it gently behind my ear, then let his hand fall back to his side. I drove back in the morning. The road was slick, but I took my time. Mark was in the kitchen when I returned, sipping coffee and reading the paper. He looked up, his face unreadable, but not cold. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked. I didn't lie. I found clarity and kindness, and the realization that we don't have to keep living like we're trapped in an old photograph. He nodded. Then I'm glad you went. We didn't speak much that day, but something had shifted. We were no longer pretending. We were letting go of the idea that marriage had to mean forever, if forever came at the cost of our own becoming. A few weeks later, we sat across from each other and made the decision. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but with love. The kind that says, you deserve more. So do I. We parted quietly, gracefully, and remained kind. Friends, even in a way that only comes after weathering a storm together. As for David, I saw him again, and again after that. It didn't turn into a whirlwind romance. It wasn't meant to. It was a slow unfolding, a series of quiet conversations, thoughtful glances, long walks, and laughter that came more freely with time. And one night, under a clear sky, he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world he wanted to understand, and I let him. Not because I needed saving, but because I'd finally chosen myself.